I've worked at the Centre for Alternative Technology for 31 years, and I don't drive a car, so I pass through Shrewsbury quite a lot as I'm coming and going, and it's really nice to be invited to talk here. I'm part of the Centre for Alternative Technology. I've been working on green solutions since 1988, and we've been doing zero carbon Britain modelling since 2005. We launched our first report in the all-party parliamentary climate change group, and now is the time we've been waiting for. It's really, really exciting to see the amount of interest. So what I put together is an overview of the model that we've done and a bit of background work that might help policymakers and citizens think how best to react. So one of the things, being a sort of engineer, is to understand the problem. So unpicking how we got into this mess is very useful. If we look at the amount of energy that we use to deliver what society wants for our individual lifestyle, it's just gone up and up and up and up over time. We've got used to using more and more energy, but that hasn't just happened by chance. There's been a very deliberate process that, I suppose, compels us to consume more. Thinking externally about the world around us outside, back in 1924, there were 4 big light bulb manufacturers. Osram were all competing to say, our light bulb shines brightest, ours lasts longest, buy our light bulb. But then the CEOs of these 4 companies were brought together by a businessman who introduced the concept of designer obsolescence. He said, gentlemen, if you agree to half the life of your light bulb, you'll sell twice as many and make twice as much profit. So 1924 light bulb would last 2,000, 2,500 hours. They launched it as guaranteed to last 1,000 hours without stating that that's half as long as it was lasting just a couple of months before. It worked very well, it took off, lots of other businesses looked on, and it's sort of reshaping how we think about things, making things deliberately designed to break. It led to planned obsolescence, which really took off in the 1950s. Brooks Stevens, we do this for the soundest of reasons, to make money. So everything from your washing machine, your fridge, your laptop, your computer, they've carefully thought when it needs to break. Or even looking at the business model. The business model behind printers isn't selling printers, it's actually selling cartridges. So they design the cartridges with a little counter in them, and after so many counts, it goes, I'm empty, you need to buy a new cartridge. But in fact, geeks I know have got in the back of them and they've reset the chip and they found you can print nearly as many again from the same cartridge. It's this planned obsolescence that's causing us to have a much higher footprint than we need in terms of the material goods. But it's also true in terms of how we move ourselves around between different cities, because back in the day, every big city had tramways, light urban tramways that were powered by electricity, that were clean in the city at least, and could move thousands of people from the city centres and the factory areas to where they lived. But these were bought up and deliberately scrapped as we moved to an economy that wanted to make manufacturing cars central to economic success. And in America, National City Lines actually bought up the urban tramways, and it turns out that they were owned by tire, car and oil companies who deliberately scrapped them. So the way we move ourselves around has changed deliberately. Also, if we look at moving between cities, this is the rail network in Britain in 1963. And a huge amount of people put in an enormous amount of labour, and many people died making this rail network. Between 63 and 84, it was cut drastically. Now I'm in Machynlleth here, and I regularly have to go to Swansea and Cardiff for dealing with Welsh Government. So in 1963, I'd carry on past Aberystwyth, it would take an hour and a half, but now I have to come all the way around, even though it does mean visiting Shrewsbury, which is nice. But going all the way down, it takes about 4 hours, so most people drive. Now, it's called the Beechings Axe. Most people have heard of the Beechings Axe, but it turns out that Beeching was a civil servant who did essentially the numbers, but the minister behind it was Ernest Marples. And Ernest Marples had been the director of Marples Ridgeway, a massive motorway building company, because it made huge amounts of money out of building motorways. So when rail lines were closed in America or France or other countries, the land that the rail line had been on was held in public trust in case we ever needed to reconnect it for any reason. But here the land was sold off and people have built lots and lots of houses on the rail line between Aberystwyth and Swansea. So if we wanted to reconnect it, which a lot of people do, we'd have to bulldoze lots of people's houses, which makes it much more controversial than if it was just simply relaying the tracks. We built houses. We built hundreds of thousands of houses. Now, if we'd managed to use some sort of Doctor Who technology and go to the ancient Aztecs and say, ancient Aztecs, can you build these houses for us? They'd have pointed all the houses south because they knew if you have an opening in your house with a stone floor, you can collect the heat of the sun. If we'd asked the Victorians to build them, they'd have built clusters of houses, schools, factories and shops together. But we built enormous amounts of houses, absolutely miles from anywhere, with no public transport infrastructure. And even the houses that were built in the early 2000s are nowhere near as energy efficient as they could be or as houses are in other countries. So what I'm saying is that the physical landscape has been deliberately designed to use more energy and use more stuff. But it's not just the external landscape, it's our own internal landscapes that's been redefined, moving us from seeing ourselves as citizens into seeing ourselves as consumers, keying into our basic instincts and converting needs into wants, compelling us to spend, update and upgrade and changing how we think about ourselves. And the theories of that you could trace back to many people, but one of the pioneers of that was Edward Bernays. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Freud came up with the subconscious theories of fears and desires that help us understand that there are drivers that make us behave in particular ways that we're not even conscious of. But rather than writing papers like Uncle Siggy did, Bernays took these theories to the corporates and said, gentlemen, I can create demand for a product you haven't even invented yet. So his first big success was getting more women to smoke cigarettes. He about tripled the amount of cigarettes smoked by women by rebranding them as torches of freedom. So rather than maybe seeing something that was a bit unladylike, that you did quietly behind the stairs, it was something that was almost like a gesture of rebellion, and he actually mocked up photos of people pretending to be women's emancipation leaders smoking cigarettes as a gesture of rebellion. Light a lucky strike and you'll never miss the sweets that make you fat. Key it into people's subconscious fears and desires, and they will go for it. And this is very well summed up in Adam Curtis's documentary, The Century of the Self. And that's free to watch online. Basically, the idea of hard-working people didn't just go out and buy things, because you've got to work for hours and hours to earn the money, so why would we go and buy a new sofa when we've already got a sofa that's perfectly fine? But associating products with status became a way of encouraging people to buy more, and rather than shopping being a chore, shopping became fun. So whatever it was associated with happiness and status, and it was all pioneered in America in the 50s on huge shopping malls that were miles from anywhere people lived. You drove miles to get there. So consequently, the amount of energy underpinning our lifestyle since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has just gone up and up and up. And it's coal, oil and gas. Huge amounts of coal, oil and gas, abundant, cheap, easy to access petrochemicals. So we must understand where we are now and what is going on out there today in Shrewsbury is not normal on any historical timeline. The amount of energy we're using in a typical day today is far, far higher than we've ever used before. But I'm not standing up here and saying using energy is bad, we shouldn't use energy. Using energy is fabulous. It's given us some remarkable things like the Rolling Stones, like the air ambulance, like lifeboats, like technology, like hospitals, like schools. It's fabulous. It's transformed our world, and we've had a happier time in many ways than any previous generations. But the problem is that we're not just using a sensible amount of money, right? We're using a huge amount of energy that we don't actually need on stuff we don't actually need, that's designed to break its hold around the world. And the idea that we have more fun, better relationships, greater success if we buy more, eat more, travel more, spend more, has become a sort of mindset instilled in us. But the consequence of doing that, of pulling all those fossil fuels up from deep within the earth, and when they were formed, they caught carbon out the atmosphere, they locked it up deep in the earth. If we burn them, we let that carbon back out in the atmosphere. So at the end of last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it very clear that the amount of warming that we allow for the Earth makes a big difference. The idea of just keeping it to 2 degrees C is not compliant anymore. We have to keep it well below 2 degrees, aim for 1.5 or below, because the difference between 1.5 and 2 in the amount of warming is ruinous. And this is the IPCC, which is like the meridian of all of the global scientific opinion. It's the consensus that we all came to. And so it means refiguring the human world within a generation. Now, because that's the midpoint, there are many other people and many other scientists who say, well, actually, 0 by 2050 isn't fast enough, particularly for a long industrialized country that's been burning fossil fuels for 150 years. So many towns, cities, councils are considering 2030, even Nottingham has held a target for 2028, because we know we have to do it faster. So this is the work that we've been doing. We take the 2010 baseline emissions and we explore, where is it all coming from? What are we doing that's creating this amount of emissions? It's 650 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So most of it's burning fossil fuels. If you burn fossil fuels in aeroplanes high in the sky, it has a multiplier effect, which is the light blue, the aviation effect. There's some in non-energy from industrial process, from manufacturing, some from land use, and there is some natural carbon sequestration happening as trees grow in natural systems, but we're nowhere near in balance. What we're giving off is far higher than what's been locked up. So the challenge to acting on that is what we consider as the yawning chasm. It's the gap between what's politically acceptable, what you're happy that politicians think businesses are happy with, and then the other side is what the science actually demands we do, which is much faster and much deeper than politics as usual. But what's interesting is that is now moving, and this side is getting much, much, much more populated, particularly in the last year. So if we're to convince all those people out there in Shrewsbury having a lovely sunny evening that we need to do this, how do we do that? Well, I think evidence-based optimism. If we can't imagine the world and begin to paint a picture of what it might be like if we do this, then how will people know that it's a better world? How will people know that it's viable? So this is what we try to do with Zero Carbon Britain. But right from the start, I'll say this is not meant to be the only way to save the planet. This is one viable scenario that's evidence-based, that's fast enough to begin to satisfy the needs of the climate science, but it's designed to open conversations. There's two fundamental processes that we look at in Zero Carbon Britain. First one is powering down the amount of energy we use to deliver society's needs by doing it in a smarter, efficient way, and we'll look at that in detail. The other is powering up clean energy sources from around the UK so that we're reliant on our own energy supply, which makes us more resilient to the turbulent world. So if you're going to do a model, you've got to design your criteria first of all. We begin by doing it, we said, let's not have any technologies that don't already exist. Because you could say, yes, and we can do this, and because we're going to invent these kites that fly up into the atmosphere and they'll capture the sunlight and they'll beam it down to these reflector discs. If it doesn't actually exist, if you can't go and see it in real life, we don't include it. We only use technology that's real, and we try to minimize the impacts on what people perceive as normality, normal quality of life, and we build in deep resilience. So let's think about powering down, first of all. The amount of energy, 2010 baseline, is 1,700 terawatt hours per year. Now that breaks up into 4 key types, and we've coloured them accordingly. Heating buildings. Red. The green is all the appliances like projectors, phone chargers that happen within buildings, the amount that industry uses, and the amount we use to move ourselves and move stuff around. So we calculate that within a sort of 10, 15 year period, we can reduce that by about 60%. So we look at them sector by sector. In industry, we give industry the same amount as they use now because we're going to be really busy and we want to be building lots of things, so we definitely use the same amount of energy. But other areas we can make drastic reductions. If we think it's about 600 terawatt hours per year is what we use energy for heating buildings and heating water in buildings in the UK. So we can actually bring that down significantly to about 230 terawatt hours per year, and 100 terawatt hours of that is actually ambient heat. It's heat that's already in the ground or in the air that you can pump it in with heat pumps into your well-insulated buildings. So you take a typical house in the UK, it consumes about 10,000 kilowatt hours per year, average house. Then you go through it like a dose of salts. You insulate the wall, the roof, the floor, better windows, doors, reduce drafts, reduce air leakage, better controls, so you're only heating the rooms you're going to use, slightly lower internal temperatures. We calculate you can bring that down to about 4,000 kilowatt hours per year per building. Now if you do that retrofit to a building, that building is still going to be there for the next 30 years, and it's going to be using an awful lot less energy. So its heating costs will go down, which will pay for the retrofit over time. It's not a cost, it's a net investment. And particularly if we're thinking about fuel poverty. There's a lot of people in the UK living in fuel poverty. If we do this at a mass scale, in the same way as the costs of solar panels have come down enormously, because the scale went up faster than anybody imagined. If we can bring the costs down by doing it at scale, there's an enormous amount of jobs for people in there. We can create a lot of trained people to go through and help reduce fuel poverty. The transport, again, is one of the biggest. It's sort of thinking about how we move ourselves and how we move stuff around. So we move from about 700 terawatt hours drastically down to about 150, 160. Now, we can't just do that by having everybody switch to electric vehicles. It's more complex than that. What we have to think about is travelling less and travelling differently, first of all. So if we assume that everybody in Britain travels a bit less in 10, 15 years' time, what we calculated was 15% fewer miles overall, perhaps as a result of policies that encourage teleconferencing, people living closer to where they work, and fewer miles that you travel by car. So there's about 15% reduction, not massive, but a big switch to getting people on buses and trains by deliberately designing the buses and train systems to work for when the people need them. So you can have a map of all of the transport journeys you have in Shropshire, and when people, like a Google Maps, people can place up all the journeys they want to do. The publicly owned municipal transport system can then design a bus service that delivers what people need. And there's very many examples like Freiburg in Germany where they've rethought the public transport system to deliver what people want. But also getting people walking and cycling more, creating safe routes for walking and safe routes for cycling. So by travelling less and travelling differently, we calculate it'll be about 35% reduction, and then switching to light smart electric vehicles powered by clean renewable energy can bring that down to about 78%. So these are not meant to be the only way of doing it. These are our rough calculations that show what we think is achievable. But if we're going to do this, we have to power it all with clean energy. So we begin looking at powering up Britain. Can we really keep the lights on with 100% renewable energy is one of the most common questions. So we pulled together an energy modelling team that accessed hourly data, real weather data for around the UK, hour by hour by hour, 87,000 hours. So you can begin to plot the output from various different renewable sources, like offshore wind farms. We looked at the output from particular offshore wind farms and then scaled it up to all the available inshore waters, shallow, near shore, spread it about top-bottom because that gives you a greater sort of stability of output, because sometimes when it's windy near the bottom it's not windy at the top, and inshore areas particularly. So we began to think about where we can put them. And then if you add to that not just the onshore wind, but you add all the different other types of renewables, onshore, offshore, solar PV, hydro, biofuels. You come up with the electricity supply graph, hour by hour. And then you look at the electricity demand, because even though you're powering down the amount of energy you're using, it still varies with time of day, it still varies with the season. So the estimates begin to point out where we have shortfalls and where we have surpluses in the grid. And then you can begin to alter the mix of renewables in the grid to try and minimise the shortfalls and minimise the surpluses. When you think you've got the optimum model, then you look at what are the energy storage systems that are available that can begin to look at how we can capture the peaks. Because if it's my job to deal with the electricity grid, if I'm the grid manager for this DNO, District Network Operator, if dealing with the peaks is every bit as big a problem as dealing with the troughs, because you can't let the voltage go too high, so you have to capture the peaks. And there's technologies developed now which can begin to capture energy in all sorts of different ways. There's all sorts of batteries we can use, and if we look at the amount of batteries or big flywheels or pumping compressed air into coal mines, there's all sorts of short-term storage that really does help, but it doesn't solve the problem. We need big amounts of energy that can be stored. So we looked at projects happening on the ground in Europe, real projects up to 1 megawatt, where you take surplus electricity. First of all, you can export half of it and sell it to our European neighbours. But the other half, you use electrolysis to split that into hydrogen and oxygen. Then you could say, right, and we'll have hydrogen as our energy store, and we'll have a hydrogen gas grid and hydrogen power stations. We could do that. It would work, but it would be expensive because we'd have to rebuild all of the infrastructure. But what they're doing, looking at the Sabatier process and the Fischer-Tropsch process, which can make liquid fuels, is to actually capture carbon dioxide out the atmosphere now, add that to the hydrogen, and make synthetic biogas and synthetic liquid fuels, which means when you burn them, you're not letting carbon out from deep beneath the ground in fossil fuel. You're actually just cycling it round and round. But you're using that to upgrade your hydrogen to synthetic methane, which you can put in the existing gas grid, in the existing combined cycle gas turbines that we already have. So we can then go to the gas industry and go, you're part of this solution. We need to actually probably double the amount of gas storage we have in the UK. And that means we can use that in backup power stations to keep the lights on when the wind's not blowing. And the Store and Go project, you can look at this online, has lots of real-life examples that they're testing out how to use the surplus from renewables to store the energy to deploy it when it's needed. So the numbers, more or less, 82% of the time in the model, supply exceeds demand as a surplus. But this 18% shortfall, if you begin to move loads around, you give an incentive to charge cars at a particular time or do your washing, a bit like the Economy 7 that we've had in Britain for decades, but a bit more flexible, you can remove that 18 down to 15. It's not a big difference, but it's an important difference. Then the remaining 15 can be filled by carbon neutral synthetic gas that can be accumulated over the years in gas stores, ready to see us through the difficult times of the winter. But if we're to capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to add to the hydrogen, we need to think about land use. So at this point we employed a professional dietitian who helped us look at the 4 different types of food we eat. Starchy foods, high protein, high fats and sugars, and fruit and veg. So if you take the government's Eat Well pledge, with what they suggest is a good balance of these 4 foods, that's the inner circle. So we should be eating 33% fruit and veg. The average diet is about 9%. We should be eating 10% high fats and sugars. We're eating 43%. So we're actually way out of kilter with the healthy diet for a happy, healthy human. So what we're suggesting is not that everybody has to be vegetarian or everybody has to be vegan. In this diet, we're suggesting there's a move towards the right mix of foods for a healthy human being. And then we plotted out the amount of land we use in the UK to produce food. Firstly, one of the surprising things is we're actually importing 42% of the food we need. Now, we can reduce that. There's some things like chocolate that we really struggle to grow here, but if you find in the supermarket, as I did the other day, packeted radishes that have come from Peru, we can grow radishes around here, perfectly normal. So what we're thinking about is reducing food waste, reducing food imports, and analysing the amount of land that goes for each type of food. Basically, it's about the yellow and the purple. It's huge amounts of land is used to grow food, to feed animals, so that we can eat or milk the animals. But we're eating too much fat, so if we reduce that down, we can actually free up land for carbon capture and storage and for producing the carbon to add to the hydrogen to make synthetic fuels. Now, if we do that, we can actually recognise that this and this are actually new income streams for the farming community. And if we look back at the history of farming, if we get maps out of Shropshire farming going back to 1760 and look at it, you find that there's actually a very much more diverse mix of crops in farming tradition than there is today. So we're not suggesting that we ditch farming altogether, but we revitalise farming by learning from the indigenous wisdom and the traditions and the mixed cropping that we did in the past and move back to growing more things like oats and more things like radishes here and connecting food cycles more locally so that the money doesn't all go to the supermarkets. But basically, if we look at this, if we switch from renewables, we get pretty much down to zero. Now, there's still some aviation effects there because even if we say we've got to be able to still fly if we're going to have a viable future. So in the scenario, you can have a long-haul flight every couple of years. But if you have a long-haul flight, it still has that multiplier effect in the atmosphere, high up. So we have to deal with that. We have to look at the industrial process. Even if you can make steel a lot cleaner, if you've got huge amounts of surplus electricity, you can make steel in different ways. And if we reduce the emissions from land use, there's still some, because we still have meat. But we can actually increase the net negatives to bring us into balance so that we've reduced the emissions enough that we can balance them off by doubling the forest cover in the UK, by revitalising the peat bogs, by actually increasing the viability of nature and natural systems. So we've done this not as a way of saying this is the only way to do it, you have to do what we're saying. This is a conversation starter to help councils and governments and policymakers begin to ask the right sorts of questions. But to add to that, because this is focused on the UK, we produced another report at the end of last year called Raising Ambition, where we looked at 130 scenarios from other countries around the world that have ambition, that are looking to meet the Paris Agreement. And we've made it free to download, so you can click on all the hot links, so you can look at what 100% renewable Tanzania might look like. Or Los Angeles Public Service Department is still looking at this. So to overcome the barriers of change, we need to have different types of conversations. And the sorts of work that we're offering for free to the public is designed to open those conversations. It's not the only way to save the planet, it's a way of triggering economic and political debate. The key message is that all the technologies are out there. We're not desperately waiting for another eco-widget to be developed. Rather than an unresolved technical challenge, actually crossing that yawning chasm and doing what the science demands we do is actually economic, cultural and psychological barriers. So changing how millions of people live is a complex problem, because if you look at me, the forces that shape what I do, tomorrow, the day after, private and personal beliefs, social networks, those surround me, the organisations I work for, or how my house is organised, public, laws, and culture, what's considered normal behaviour. So all of those different forces on different levels all shape how we behave. So to try and help people, we produced a report called Making It Happen, which identifies key barriers and then looks at real-life examples of how we've overcome them in culture, psychology, sociology, arts, democracy, economics particularly. And we've made that free to download for anybody in the world. And there's lots and lots of useful things there that can begin to think about how we respond to what's happening. So one of the things that we've experienced, particularly in my country, is this rising recognition that we need to be doing something, but nothing is happening fast enough. So one of the next thing I suggest a council considers is a public declaration to say, we recognise this is a big problem and we're going to begin to make a plan of action. Because then that means people are shouting in the streets, you must do more. They're saying, how can we help? And in Machynlleth, it's a really interesting story because it was the first town in Wales to declare a climate emergency.
Now, Machynlleth is hoping to dramatically reduce its carbon footprint after becoming the first town in Wales to declare a climate emergency. The move is part of a global trend which has seen more than 20 towns and cities, including Melbourne and London, make similar declarations. Our environment correspondent, Stefan Messenger, has more.
Machynlleth, a market town in mid-Wales with a proud history, determined to take on the challenges of the future too.
There were all sorts of suggestions about trying to make the town as low carbon as possible, zero carbon if possible, to support people in trying to work together in low energy transport solutions, and maybe to help people to understand how they can make their homes more energy efficient so that they can use less energy and save money.
Town councillors have committed to producing a climate change action plan within 6 months, after being presented with a petition signed by 500 local people. Machynlleth's decision means it's the first in Wales to join a global network of towns and cities committed to dramatically reducing their carbon footprint. The movement was started in Melbourne, Australia, and since then many other places have followed suit in declaring a climate emergency, including London and Bristol. Support ranged from the town's butcher, in the hope it'll encourage people to ditch their cars and shop locally, to the doctor's surgery, which claims there could be health benefits too.
More opportunities for safe exercise outside, better air quality, and also I thought that if the health centre was behind this petition to the town council, it would be a powerful message to the council that other parts of the community really wanted to support this.
Inspired by Machynlleth's move, Powys County Council also pledged today to put a plan in place to curb emissions.
The leadership that we need hasn't come from national government, it's coming from local authorities, it's coming from town councils, it's coming from civil society groups getting together and saying, we need to do this. So to see Machynlleth, our own town, being the first in Wales is very uplifting.
Making a difference will require funding though, and the town council says it hopes to apply for Welsh Government and lottery cash. The first step is to ask the people of Machynlleth for ideas in a public consultation over the next few months.
So it's really interesting what's been happening. I mean, if we go back to probably January this year, there was Machynlleth and a few others had declared. Then this website popped up, which is climateemergency.uk, and on it they have a map, and they map out where it's declared, and I was sort of screenshotting it every month or a couple of months, and the rate at which councils have declared is quite astounding. Now over half of the councils in the UK have declared, and there are many, many more declarations in the pipeline, and climateemergency.uk can give you links to all of the declarations that different councils have made. It's a rising tide. And then Welsh Government was the first national government to declare a climate emergency, and then the UK Historic Commons motion to declare an environmental climate change emergency. So the recognition that we need to do something has grown enormously, very, very quickly. The other week, Arts and Culture declared. I was invited down to the Roundhouse where cultural networks were declaring climate emergencies. Artists like Ormley were there to say that we have to recognise it's not just about fitting energy efficient light bulbs in our theatres. We have to think about the message or the mind print that we're using through our life. So it's time to deliver action plans now, because we can't just make a declaration and go, tick box, that's done, council's done its job now. We have to convert the declarations into action plans to start delivering stuff. So we've been working with local areas in transport, energy, housing, food, waste, buildings and land use, and there's all sorts of zero carbon groups springing up all over the country that have achieved a huge amount. So the sorts of things that I think we need to think about is firstly make it public, a civic announcement. When that happened in Machynlleth, all the people in Extinction Rebellion turned up to the council and said, we will help make the plan. They agreed to set up housing, transport, food, culture working groups, and they worked with towns, councillors, they worked with experts from all the businesses and industries, they worked with the butcher to make a plan, and they presented that back to the council. And it has to be an open and inclusive process, because that's the idea of citizens' assemblies. If you make it open and inclusive so that people have an input to what the plan is, then it's not something that's imposed upon people. It has to have a clear process and an end point. Map out who's in your area, who has influence, who has knowledge, with the businesses that have expertise in different areas. Connect locally with the topics that are important, with the industries that are in your town, with the agriculture. And set up working groups and a steering group to keep their eye on the working groups and try and make sure that the ideas are cross-fertilised between them. But if you're a councillor, you've got to recognise what the boundaries are. You're not responsible for everything. You're responsible for a set fixed jurisdiction. So you have to work that out within your council group and fully understand that this is what Shrewsbury Town Council is responsible for. And then cross-fertilise real-life examples of what actually works, where there have been mass retrofits of buildings or rethinking transport systems. Not just imagining stuff, looking at who's actually achieved it and going and found that out. And then thinking about multi-solving, particularly if you make an investment in setting up cycle routes, then more people will cycle. But the benefits from that might accrue in a health budget, because if more people cycle, then people are healthier. There was a project in the Ashton looked at, the Birmingham Big Bikes, where they took a health budget and they used that money to buy bikes, and then they gave them to people who didn't move about very much. Here, have a free bike. In return to having a little chip in the bike that would then record the number of miles it's done and hand it in. And they calculated then that if people who've got the bikes are cycling this amount every day, then the reduction in the healthcare costs in the future will more than cover the costs of giving them the bicycles now. So think about that. But multi-solving is, it just means recognising that the investment in here might produce savings in the health budget. It doesn't necessarily accrue in the same, but keep up momentum and celebrate successes. So if you're thinking about, this is our council at whatever, town council level, how can we really have influence? Well, first of all, your council can have influence directly downwards in what it has jurisdiction over. Thinking about what we have procurement contracts for. Say we're buying school dinners in, or we're buying food for the hospital, or we're buying people's services to do road repairs. You can think about doing that and specifying that in a greener way, and doing that in a way that focuses on local supply chains, because that gets the benefits locally. Preston Town Council have done that. Preston is not what you think of as a very unusual council. It seems perfectly normal, but they've pioneered what they call the Preston model of putting the contracts into local suppliers rather than just large transnational corporates. So think what your jurisdiction is down in your own council. Then think your council is responsible to the county council or the district council, and then begin lobbying them for the larger changes you need to make the changes happen in your area. Then think about the councils that you know, the councils nearby, the councils that you're twinned with. Quite a lot of towns are actually twinned with other towns. So if the mayor sends a letter to the mayors of the towns twinned with saying, we've declared this and we're doing an action plan, you begin to cross-fertilise that. Look through, I mean, we're hoping that the local government association will rise to this and produce action plans and cross-fertilisation tools. But the final way is to look into the council staff. And if somebody's making decisions about buildings, and they haven't had a basic one-day carbon literacy course, where they haven't had the basic training to understand the problem and the solutions, then they're not compliant to make decisions about spending. And it's the same with health and safety or all sorts of other things. Basic one-day training can make a big difference to how people make decisions. So finally, I'd say the important thing is to think about multi-solving, because climate protection can increase resilience, it can make food and water different, it can create jobs, it can put assets in different places, it can increase health, well-being and safety, and it can create jobs and industry. If we begin to think about doing it with a multi-solving mindset, that it's not just about doing this because of climate change, we try and do it that maximises the benefits. Sorts of things is looking at air quality, and the Climate Interactive report looks at the multi-solving intersection of health and climate, and how doing things in the right way can actually reduce health costs and increase human health. So beginning to have that mindset. So we do that with Zero Carbon Britain. We produced a report called People, Planet and Planet, where we're balancing changes in diet on the health of the person who makes the changes and the impact on the planet, and trying to choose diets that are better for people. We analyse many different types of diets, but if we move in the right direction, we can solve both things at the same time. We did this about 7 years ago, but what came out this year was an incredibly powerful report from The Lancet, which is the main health magazine. Eat Lancet did a report very similar to this and found very similar facts that we can begin to multi-solve with climate and health. So we need to think about those radishes that have come all the way from Peru in a plastic bag, and think about how we can supply those more locally. If we could be more self-reliant, reducing from 42% imports to 17% imports, we actually can have more active support for our own agricultural systems. We still need some things like chocolate. We're not going to say to anybody, sorry, that's the end of coffee and tea. We still have that. But there's some things that we actually can grow here pretty well. So this increases the self-reliance. Similarly, if the UK gets all of its energy from the renewable resources that hit it in a turbulent world, we're actually more resilient than if we continue to depend upon imports from Russia or from the Middle East. It's that resilience. And if we have all of that kit installed around the UK, then at the end of the weather forecaster says, and tomorrow's weather will put this amount of money into the UK economy. Because it's like when the wind goes past and nobody catches it, it's like pound signs flying across Britain. She could even have a little slider, and if at one end of it, all of the offshore is owned by the Arab Emirates, but at the other end of the slider, it's owned by Cardiff, Birmingham, Liverpool, Belfast and Shrewsbury, then you can begin to see the difference in the figure at the bottom. And there's a very interesting report, Who Owns the Wind Owns the Future, from the Labour Energy Forum. You can download for free. It looks at the percentage ownership of current offshore wind. And about 51% is owned by public entities, by governments. But it's only 0.07 is the UK government. A lot of it is the overseas investors. There's another very interesting report come out from the unions, Unlocking the Job Potential of Zero Carbon. They calculate 980,000 transition jobs and 710,000 long-term jobs. The Sea Change report looks at moving from offshore oil to offshore wind. Very similar jobs, very similar technologies. And they calculate, because it's more diversely distributed, it's more than 3 times the number of jobs. So there's all sorts of benefits, co-benefits. But I think one of the big ones is to move away from the idea that we just have to buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we don't particularly like. And the idea that moving away from this consumption economy to actually finding other ways. If you ask people what they want more of, they'll say, I want more time with my mates, more time with the swing, more time in the garden, more time with the grandparents, more time doing football. There's lots of things we want more of that are actually really low carbon impact. But I think probably the most important one is that we must preserve the unspoilt wildernesses. Gaia's memory of how healthy organs functioned. We need to restore a lot of damaged ecosystems, so we need to keep the good stuff in good health, so we can learn from that and build a stable platform for future generations. So what we have online on the CAT website is, first of all of this to download for free to open conversations locally, but we also have a petition where we're calling for a climate emergency action plan from UK government that supports all the councils and all of the district councils, village councils, town councils that are all pressing for this, and pulls it all together into a national plan. Because we all need to come together And one of the most interesting pieces of research was done by Common Cause. They employed Ipsos Mori to research the values that people hold. And what they found is 74% of the population hold compassionate, intrinsic values of social worth and environmental worth. 74%. But 77% believe their neighbours don't hold those values. And once we come together and realise that we actually all do care, then it begins to change things. So just down the road, just down the railway line, Centre for Alternative Technology, cap.org.uk, it's all free to download. We also do lots of short courses, Zero Carbon Britain training courses, visit the centre, you can walk around and look at things and explore solutions as a Zero Carbon Britain discovery trail, or if you're really keen to get skilled up, there's postgraduate qualifications in many different areas. Thank you very much.